could see people consulting, like, how do I disrupt this negotiation? What are the rules of procedure that I could use in order to cause a problem and prevent this, or spread confusion, or change the kind of momentum that was already here.
Welcome back to Wicked Problems. I am Richard Delavan. What started as a technical negotiation about shipping emissions turned into a sequel of Goodfellas, but with a much uglier cast. Last month, at the International Maritime Organization's meeting in London, U.S. officials, according to new reporting from the Financial Times, behind the scenes in hallways and corridors, bullied, cajoled, threatened delegates from big and small countries with tariffs, with personal visa restrictions, with port fees, with retaliatory measures should the delegates affirm a vote they'd taken earlier this year and actually put into effect this global levy on carbon emissions from shipping. Shipping accounts for about 3% of global emissions and still largely runs on old-fashioned kind of bunker fuel. And these negotiations were meant to put the industry on a path towards net zero, something that was supported by most of the major players in the industry, and they've been working towards this from an investment and technology perspective for years. And the result? The talks were derailed, put off for a year in terms of discussing it even further. And the IMO, normally a technocratic body of experts solving problems, in complete shock. So what really happened behind those closed doors? Why did countries like India and China, that earlier this year had supported this move in a 63-16 vote, and even small island states, some of those climate vulnerable on Earth, decide to buckle under pressure from the U.S.? And what does it mean for wider climate negotiations as we head into talks in Brazil for COP30? So to unpack it, I spoke to three people who know this stuff inside and out. First, Arianne Morrissey, senior editor at Ship.Energy, who's been covering this and been an observer of this stuff for years and years. Professor Tristan Smith at UCL, somebody who has worked in the industry and in the defense sector before flipping to be a key voice in helping to actually move these talks forward. And finally, Carly Hicks with Opportunity Green, an NGO that's been advising and helping climate vulnerable states as they negotiate these kind of sectoral changes that are underway. So to start us off, I spoke with Arianne Morrissey of Ship.Energy to talk about this really still unfolding drama, pure political noir thriller, really. And she was in the IMO building, watching as normally quiet corridors filled with whispers, walkouts, and thinly veiled threats. And here's Arianne's take of how a once technical forum became the scene of a diplomatic mugging. Arianne, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And you've been covering maritime energy for years, and now this story that normally lives in let's forgive me, trade bulletins, is now splashed across the front pages of most of the main media in the world. So let's start there. When did you realize that this particular session of negotiations at the International Maritime Organization weren't going to be business as usual?
Well, I guess that kind of became clear from day one, that the mood in the room was very different. For a start, the tone was so much more confrontational to anything people normally see in those IMO meetings. Normally, you see a lot of discussions are quite technical, and that element of very confrontational attitude is not there, or at least that came as a surprise to many observers. And to give you an idea of that, just from day one, first morning, you saw the United States and Saudi Arabia already trying to derail the whole thing by objecting to adopting the agenda, which is normally a formality in those meetings. And I think the other thing that told me that something was a bit unusual was the fact that you saw a lot of countries that either didn't speak very much or didn't speak at all for much of the meetings. So what you saw for the majority of the week really is that you had two camps that you already knew about. So on the one side, the EU, Brazil, UK, Canada, and others who were very much in favor of that IMO net zero framework and wanted it to be adopted during that meeting. And on the other side, you had the United States, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Russia, and others who were very much against it. But in the middle, there were loads of countries where it was really difficult to tell on which side they actually were. And, from speaking to sources, speaking to delegates, it kind of became clear that a lot of these countries were actually waiting for instructions from their capitals. So that was the first indication already that the outcome of that MEPC meeting was not necessarily going to be determined in the IMO building itself, but in a lot of negotiations that were happening in the background, if that makes sense.
And so normally, if I get the sense that these are normally kind of problem-solving sessions, technical negotiations about how to do something, rather than the kind of policy debates that might happen at COP, right, or at some other forum. And those types of things now seem to have been imported into these discussions. And that seemed to come as a surprise to a lot of the people who are normally part of these things. Would that be fair to say?
Well, I think, to be honest, when you spoke to actual delegates in the IMO building during the week, even from the start, a lot of them were actually quite cautious. And a lot of them were saying, like, well, this week could go either way because we don't really know what to expect. And I think a lot of delegates were already conscious that this was not going to be the normal IMO meeting, if that makes sense.
But compared to what they were used to, like they definitely were like, "Ooh, this is our awareness is up. We're definitely prepared for something different." Yeah. But it was definitely different from what they had experienced before, right?
Yeah, definitely the level of how political that week was. That was something that was quite new, and obviously that came from the idea of incorporating all of these climate discussions in IMO meetings, which, in the past, IMO was, it is the global regulator for shipping, but obviously in the past was kind of focused on more, safety, technical regulations and so on. And so the procedures were kind of developed around that, if that makes sense. Yeah,
totally. And I guess, and so was there a moment where, again, like you said, the delegates, and we're now into October, right? So like this is obviously the predicate for this goes back to, well, I mean, the negotiations are going on for 10 years, right? I mean, in terms of, how to get to this, there have been several stages. Then in April, there was a critical vote, which some people were surprised about how easily is the wrong word, but it kind of went through, with I think 63-16
that's correct.
Vote. And there were some surprising people voting to say yes. And the agreement was that we're going to work towards a world where we're going to have net zero shipping, basically. Right? We're going to replace our existing fuels with other fuels, which we're going to, through an accounting method, figure out like, okay, we're not going to add more carbon to the atmosphere. Great. By 2050, that was going to be a gradual process. Industry was going to be on board, and a bunch of countries that, seemed surprising at the time in April said like, yeah, we're going to definitely, we're going to get on board with this, including China. So like, what were the other steps that led until, where we got to earlier this month?
Well, that's a very big question, and I'll do my best to try and summarize like 10 years of negotiations as simply as possible.
Well, let's go like the most recent ones.
Yeah, well, I guess it is still helpful to kind of like take maybe 2018 even as a starting point.
Yeah, great.
Because that's when IMO adopted its first strategy to reduce greenhouse gases from shipping. So at the time, the ambition was a 50% reduction by 2050. And then fast forward 5 years later, so 2023 is when they adopted their revised strategy. That's how they called it. And that's the moment when they adopted that legally binding target of reaching net zero. And the way they phrased it was by or around 2050.
Right.
So, and what's worth noting also is that 2023 revised strategy was adopted without a vote. It was unanimous. And so in theory, all IMO member states at that point had committed to that ambition of reaching net zero in 2050. But then negotiations turned into implementation, how, like, what kind of measures you put in place to actually get there. And the point that got really contentious was when they started talking about the midterm measures, which include what they call an economic measure, in simple terms, a pricing mechanism for greenhouse gases from shipping. And then for quite a while, you had two camps that were quite separate. So one side wanted a flat levy, so global carbon tax. Countries on the other side of the debate said, absolutely not, this is not happening. And then what happened in April is that they met somewhere in the middle. So there was this compromise solution at that NEPC 83 meeting. And to put it very, very, very simply, essentially what that did was to put a limit on the greenhouse gas intensity of the energy used on ships. And that limit was going to become gradually more stringent with time. And then you apply some penalties for ships that don't comply with that limit. And then ships that overperform can get rewards. And there was also provisions for money to go to support a just and equitable transition in developing countries. So that is the agreement that was approved. That's the technical word they use at IMO in April. And there was a vote, as you said, 63 against 16. And it's worth noting that the US at the time did not attend the meeting in April. Instead, they did send a letter saying that they opposed it and they threatened potential retaliation against those that would vote in favor. But they weren't there. They were not in the room in April. And now, under IMO procedures, essentially, once you have something that's approved, 6 months later, it comes back for adoption. And so that's what was supposed to happen at that meeting in October. The delegates would decide whether or not to formally adopt that greenhouse gas pricing mechanism for international shipping, except instead of voting on that question on the last day of the meeting, there was a motion by Saudi Arabia to say essentially that the House was divided, there was no consensus, and so we should really take a pause on this and adjourn the meeting for a year. And that motion is what was adopted by a majority. So the final result was 57 countries that voted for that postponement against 57 countries that voted for the adjournment against 49 that voted against that motion.
Right. And so, again, for people who are not read in the same way that, you know, yourself or others who cover this, you know, for a living, cover the industry for a living, right? The IMO itself, of course, is a whole full-time beat as well. But it is, I suppose people are struggling both to understand whether this is like they're under or overplaying the significance of something like this. And so for me, what was super interesting to make that clear is, as you say, in April, the US just didn't even show up for the meeting, right? But by the time of October, the US had changed very much from what I've heard in terms of its posture, not just about how it would vote, but what it would do to motivate other states, other members of the IMO, to change their vote. And I wonder if you could give us a little bit of color, because I've tried to do this math about like who voted for what in April, and I appreciate it's not technically a good read through. If you voted for adjournment, does that mean you've changed your position? Of course not. But it means you voted how maybe the U.S. wanted you to vote, and maybe you voted differently in April. And I wonder if you could, that feels like the skullduggery that went on in the background there. There's a whole thriller. Not as exciting maybe as a Bourne movie, but certainly something where lots of stuff happened in the background, and you can see the evidence of the results in some of the voting. So maybe have you looked at this a little bit? I think you have.
Yeah. So, I guess just in terms of comparing the vote results from April to October.
We know they're not like for like.
No, I guess first thing to mention, I talked about these two blocks at the beginning of the two sides.
Yes.
So those kind of stayed the same. So the EU, UK, Canada, Brazil, and so on were in favor of the deal in April. They voted against the adjournment this time. Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, and a whole bunch of other petrostates that were against the deal in April voted in favor of the adjournment this time. So that bit hasn't really changed. In terms of the countries that shifted their positions, there were some major powers that were in favor of the deal in April. I'm thinking China, India, and that actually shifted their position and this time voted in favor of the adjournment. Other countries that voted for the adjournment this time are Panama, Liberia, which for shipping is actually quite significant because they're big
Say
flag
more about
states.
that, because they're flag. What is a flag state?
So flag state is the essentially where a ship is registered. So that's
Right.
the state which has like responsibility.
And so-
And just a couple of examples to throw here, but Kenya, Guatemala, Peru, Uruguay were among those that shifted their positions. Another phenomenon that we saw happening was that some countries that were in favor abstained this time. So that was a case of Japan, South Korea, and that was also the case, and that created quite a bit of reaction of Cyprus and Greece, who basically broke EU ranks to abstain rather than voting.
Because normally there'd be a rule that all EU member states would vote together, right, in a body like this, if there's a policy agreement.
Yeah, that was the expectation.
Right.
And I should say also on the other side of the vote, what we saw is that some states, especially Pacific Island states, that were among those that were hoping for a higher level of ambition in the framework, had abstained in April because they thought the deal was not ambitious enough, and this time voted against the adjournment and were hoping for it to be adopted.
I mean, just so, yeah. I mean, situation normal, all effed up mess as a normal, diplomacy these days. But extraordinary that China, India voted for something in April. And again, states like Liberia and Panama, and again, Guatemala, Uruguay, I've heard Trinidad and Tobago, some others. What is, from your reporting, whether or not you've published yet, like, why in your reporting did these states change their vote?
Well, I guess there's potentially multiple reasons, but what we understand was the number one reason for many of those countries to change their votes was US pressure, and that US pressure was made quite explicit in a statement that was published on actually the Friday just before NEPC started. So in that statement, they literally detailed the potential retaliation that they were considering against member states that would vote.
And what was that statement? Was that like a note to like different states, or was that the Trump's Truth Social post, which came later?
No, that was... Give me 1 second. Okay, yeah. So essentially, that was literally a press release on their website. So that was there for everybody to see. And in terms of the potential retaliations that they were considering, that included blocking vessels registered in those countries from entering US ports, visa restrictions, financial penalties, additional port fees, potential sanctions on officials. So when I spoke to delegates in the room, many of them told me like literally everybody has received some sort of pressure from the United States, and that included the highest level of government. So this kind of became a discussion about more than just shipping. There were all sorts of other agendas that were in consideration. That being said, there were also a number of countries in the room that expressed reservations about the framework itself. Some found it too complicated. Others were worried that it would increase costs of shipping, and that would impact especially developing countries. Others thought that it was going too fast, given the lack of availability of alternative fuels today. And so there could also, when I spoke to delegates who actually voted to adjourn the procedures, some of them said that they were hoping that that year would give them time to perhaps build more of a consensus around that framework. So that could also be an element that would explain why we ended up with the result that we saw.
Okay. Well, I suppose we'll find out as the months go on. I guess heading towards our, this. Thank you so much for your generosity with your time, by the way. Heading towards our close here, because I want to let you go for the rest of your day. But basically, is there a plan B? Like I say, you've spoken to delegates and countries who are planning to use the next year and see what they can do and build a consensus, etc. But if they can't, this was meant to be one of the most progressive, important milestones in actually having a industry get to grips with how do you do the practical hard work of decarbonizing. And some people have, perhaps looked at this as a setback that might describe all of climate action. And some people have gone like, well, it's more complicated, blah, blah, blah. But, there's no question that this was people who were expecting something different. And the question is whether or not this multilateral approach via the IMO, via this UN body, is, does this say anything about the viability of that sort of approach if an actor like the United States is going to go around smashing whatever vases they can to prevent people from actually coming to an agreement? Does that say anything about it as an approach entirely? Is there a plan B if that approach is no longer valid?
I guess there's a lot in your questions. I'll try to go point by point. But in terms of a plan B, what we're likely to see now is, on the one side, I think a lot of people in the industry are actually waiting to see how the next year unfolds. So it's worth mentioning that immediately after that MEPC meeting, there was a working group meeting to develop implementation guidelines for the framework, even though the framework has not been formally adopted. And what we've been hearing from that working group meeting, which is close to media, is actually that discussions have been quite constructive. So we're going to have to keep an eye on what happens there, and then what happens when MEPC, that Marine Environment Protection Committee, meets again in April next year. But I think in the meantime, when you asked about the plan B, what we're likely to see is more regional regulation emerging. We've already seen that with the EU. So there's EU ETS that was expanded to shipping as of January last year. Fuel EU Maritime that entered into force in January this year. So those regional regulations are still there, and they're still putting some financial pressure on the industry to decarbonize. So it's going to be interesting to see how other countries, other regions think of perhaps developing their own mechanisms for that. And quite interestingly, this is precisely what the shipping industry wanted to avoid. So in the leading up to those MEPC discussions, you had loads of statements from bodies representing the industry, including the International Chamber of Shipping, which represents kind of 80% of the world's ship owners, who basically said that they were desperate for certainty, desperate for clarity, because as I said earlier, shipping being such an international industry, it becomes really complicated for individual companies when they have to deal with multiple regulatory frameworks depending on the region where they happen to call at any given time. So the industry actually wanted that global framework so that they would have like a level playing field globally, one set of rules. And so the fact that this framework was delayed, calls into question whether or not this is going to happen, and if not, then the industry is going to face what they call a patchwork of regional measures, and that's going to bring more costs and more administrative burdens actually for the industry.
And are there particular companies or even states that you're looking at and you're reporting for indicators of like some, again, the most industries, right? There's an 80-20 rule. A very few number of entities are the ones who actually have to shoulder the burden of having to deal with compliance or non-compliance or the patchwork of regulations. So are there particular firms or particular groups of firms or particular states that you're looking to as early indicators of how they're going to be reacting to this, again, continuing, perhaps unexpectedly continuing level of uncertainty?
I guess one place I'll keep looking at is the alternative fuel order book. So essentially the number of ships capable of running on alternative fuels, that data is being released monthly. And what was actually quite interesting to see is that when you looked at the figures for August and September, so just before the vote, or just before that extraordinary MEPC session, you saw that the number of orders for those ships capable of using alternative fuels went down. And that was interpreted as ship owners kind of adopting that sit back and wait approach.
Interesting.
And so we're definitely going to keep an eye on those alternative fuels orders in the months to come, because that might indicate where the industry is going in terms of orders. And that's going to be significant, not just in the short term, because those vessels have a life expectancy, if I can call it like that, of 20, 25, even 30 years in some segments. So vessels that are being ordered today, some of them are still going to be on the water in 2050 when in theory we should be at net zero. So that's that's certainly one place we'll look at. The other thing I should say is that when we talk about first movers in the industry, the shipping industry is actually really diverse, and so there's a whole range of different segments, different routes, and you do see that the idea of adopting new fuels or new technologies can be a bit easier for ships, for example, that are on fixed routes between two ports where they know for sure that they will be able to resupply with an alternative fuel of their choice. And it can be a bit more difficult for companies that operate in what they call the tramp sector, where they don't know where their next port of call is going to be. So so that's why it's going to be like quite interesting to see like who continues to be first movers and who's going to have to wait for regulation to actually speed up action.
Well, tramp steamers, I can't believe that's still a thing, but there you go. That's I'm like I'm going to go back to my 19th century novel and figure out like the reality, deal with the reality that's still a thing. Final exit question, Arianne, Morrissey, thank you so much for doing this. Is unfair question. A lot of people have been looking at this result and inferring from it that like we should now, if this was the most hopeful, right, venue for the implementation of a sector-wide practical real-world strategy for how to get from A to B, right, how to decarbonize, whether or not everyone thought that was doable in the time frame or whatever, the ambition was there. And now that has been changed in some way. Next week, we're heading into the COP30 negotiations. And people who, particularly small island states, who might be on the wrong end of some of these things coming out of the negotiations of the IMO, what should people read from that? Should they be extrapolating this result and say the U.S. and others have actually shown their hand and said, we're coming for whatever agreements you thought you had before, and we're going to just undermine them however we can? so people can go in with their eyes open, or is that alarmist?
I think if that extraordinary MEPC session has shown one thing, it is how geopolitics is kind of inviting itself in those climate negotiations, and that's certainly a factor that we can't ignore for future negotiations. And I've actually spoken to a few people in that climate and geosphere, and they've acknowledged that in the short term it might be more difficult to reach these global climate agreements. But one thing that one person emphasized to me, actually, which was quite interesting, is that politics is ever changing. If we just look at how many countries have shifted their positions between April and October, and who knows where politics is going to be in 6 months time, or in a year's time, when delegates are set to come back to that discussion about the potential adoption of the IMO net zero framework.
Well, I think that's a fair place to leave it. Arianne, Morrissey, thank you so much for taking the time. Senior editor at Ship.Energy. We will put some links in the show notes so people can follow your work. Your coverage on this is essential, and I think that people will learn a lot going forward about where we go from here, about how to interpret some of these goings-on and machinations. Thank you so much for coming on Wicked Problems.
Well, thanks to you for having me.
So where does that leave us? If the IMO can't hold the line on something this basic, a framework the world has already agreed to once, does multilateral climate negotiations still even work? To find out, I turned to Professor Tristan Smith of UCL. He's been in these rooms for more than a decade, and he says the shock of what just happened might, paradoxically, force governments and industry to rethink how the transition actually gets done. To make sense of that, I'm joined by Professor Tristan Smith of UCL, one of the world's leading experts in shipping decarbonization, who's been in and around the IMO negotiations for more than a decade. Tristan, thanks for joining us.
Not at all. Thank you for having me.
I guess I need to start by asking a bit of a personal question. I mean, you've been involved in these talks for really quite a long time. They've certainly hit an inflection point, is probably the most neutral to positive way of putting it. But people didn't seem to see it coming, or see that this was, an outcome even as late as August, looking at the coverage and the reporting, where people, were perhaps downplaying the risks that were being posed by the opposition to the United States, Saudi, and a couple of others. What was there kind of a sense of disbelief when it kind of reached this point? Because it seemed kind of feeling like it was going to be inevitable until very late in the game.
Was there a feeling of disbelief? There was certainly a lot of shock, and I'd count myself within that. I was shocked, perhaps not so much at the outcome as the way it came about. So I recognised that this was a scenario that we would not adopt at that session, but I was surprised at the tactics that were used in order to put so much pressure on individuals as well as member states in order to shift their positions. And all of that obviously goes back to the contrast between the vote outcome in April, where we saw 90% of MARPOL signatories being supportive of the legal framework that we were looking at, suddenly switching a lot of their preferences, or at least expressing doubt. And that's the main conclusion that we have from that week of negotiation. It's an expression of doubt rather than a conclusive no. But it was still a contrast to the position that they expressed in April.
Right. And I suppose the weaponization of doubt is certainly nothing new in the broader field of climate negotiations, if we want to put it in that frame. Is that kind of what happened here in order to protect, I mean, you've said this before, in terms of the potential for the United States in particular to continue to export LNG and make that into a maritime fuel?
Well, I think every member state had to make a difficult decision, and on one side was a significant threat for retaliation, and on the other was the benefit that was represented by the adoption of the framework. And I think the scale of the threat was so large in very many cases, and in some cases it was obviously extremely large, to turn countries that have been so vocal about their need for regulation to address the risk of dangerous climate change to turn countries like that, that's extraordinary. That they would be put in a position where they would prefer to side with the United States. And so I think that what we saw was a lot of deep threat rather than manipulation of doubt as a narrative. But there is a constituency for which the doubt is a legitimization of taking a pause here. So it's a good way to justify that rather than saying, well, I was threatened by the United States, but here is my narrative, which is that I experienced some uncertainty as to whether this was the right thing to do at this time. And I think maybe that's the opportunity here, that there was a certain political landscape, and that political landscape isn't necessarily constant.
Right. But it seems likely that the political landscape wouldn't shift much in a direction that would make kind of ratification of the NZF, or I'm not sure if ratification is the correct word, but certainly it's moving forward in a year, which is when, of course, the talks are meant to resume. Is that right?
It's correct that in 12 months is when we revisit.
Right.
I don't know what's likely or unlikely at this point in time. So your question was phrased as it seems likely that this would not be able to go through in 12 months' time. I think I would say it looked likely that it was going to go through until 3 or 4 weeks ago. And there was a decision taken to put an enormous amount of resource and pay a very high cost in political capital in the United States to disrupt the decision, at least to buy this 12-month hiatus. And I don't know if that sort of resource is going to be available in 12 months' time. I don't know if it would reach the same level of political prioritization, because clearly back in April, when the same administration was in the White House, they also chose to resist, but not with quite so much vehemence. So I think what is likely or unlikely, I will avoid giving you a clear answer on, because I think there's a lot of uncertainty in exactly how that landscape will evolve over the next 12 months, and therefore what it makes the likelihood of the outcome to be. I think all I can say, and I'm happy to commit to, is that we know that the strength of feeling in the United States and the resource that they're prepared to put behind it is a significant input to the determinant, or significant determinant of the outcome.
And in terms of industry, I mean, again, one of the things that obviously because this has been going on for quite a long time, and industry had a chance to get used to the idea, and also thinking about the investments that they would need to make, both in retooling existing parts of fleet, port, shore resources at port, the kind of suppliers of fuels that would need to be coming on stream to provide alternatives, kind of rolling out over the coming years. So what happens to all of that? Is everyone still redoing their sums and recalculating? And is that where there might be people providing a kind of countervailing force to say, that's all very well and good, we had a pause, but the maths are still the maths, and we kind of have to do this because we've already committed? Is that where the hope comes from?
So the hope comes from the fundamentals, which is that the sector needs a stability that the IMO provides. And if we don't have an IMO functioning and we have lots of patchworks of regional regulation, then the decision-making for any ship owner, the admin burden for a ship owner becomes incredibly difficult for their operations. So I think there's one motivation, which is that. I'd say on the ship owner side, there's a limited amount of investment which is threatened by this outcome. There was quite a lot of conservatism already. Not many vessels that were fully aligned to this transition had been invested in. The real people who have the risk here are in the fuel production and the energy supply chain, and they will be really threatened by what just happened unless they're able to underpin their product with a different regional policy or other offtake. And so one of the mitigations of the very worst case scenario of causing a massive dent in investment that has already been created is the fact that there remains an EU regulation, there remain national regulations, and there remain countries that are very invested in the energy transition, seeing industrial opportunity, and so will hopefully step up and provide even more support now that we don't have the IMO regulation. And I would say that actually when we look back at our, as you said at the beginning, our work has been going on for a good decade on this. We never saw the IMO as the sole actor in the transition. It's only in the last couple of years, particularly since July 2023, when it adopted the revised strategy with very stringent targets in it for both 2030 and 2040, that a lot of the driving force of the transition has been located at the IMO. Prior to that, the assumption was that this would need a mix of actors, and a lot of the strategy at corporate level, but also in the research community, has been working on that assumption for a longer period than it has been working on the assumption that the IMO was the only show that we needed to have.
That's okay. Well, that's a key point. So this isn't the only game in town, as it were.
Exactly.
But that does. I mean, I suppose it's for non-specialists like myself. I suppose the IMO provides a kind of theater that makes it easier to cover, because of the fact that the idea of having a multilateral global framework where 97% of tonnage would be covered, done. Thank you. We can now cover something else. Whereas this patchwork. I mean, I'm just even looking at even the last few days, the number of announcements of so-called green shipping corridors between Mumbai and Rotterdam, or Rotterdam and several cities, and a Chinese city, and a port in France. It's a bewildering array of little agreements, that would seemingly add up to something, but digging all that out and doing the analysis of it becomes a much different task, than writing a pithy tweet, I suppose.
It does, absolutely. There's no question that a multilateral solution would be more cost effective if it could be agreed. But if it can't be agreed, then there are alternative means, and a lot of maritime innovation has actually happened in national or regional niches. And ironically, the LNG transition was significantly driven by action in Scandinavia. And so some of this can unlock within regions that see opportunity in the short term and a long run case that there will be some regulation to drive it. And I think that's possibly the key message from the IMO here. The IMO has always had regulation intent, and it had an intent to also agree something which has now been postponed, but the revised strategy, which sets the absolute emission reduction objectives that organisation unanimously supported, that still exists, and I would expect that to continue to exist. And so there is this knowledge that there will be regulation one day. Now, let's talk about this as two phases. There's an early adoption phase for a decarbonisation of shipping, which needs some subset of the global fleet to be using a new fuel and proving that new fuel can be used safely, and proving that the supply chains can mature and getting information about what that will look like. And then there's a mass market transition. And what the IMO's net zero framework was trying to do was both of those things. It had components within it to stimulate early adoption, and it had components to stimulate mass market transition. But those other transitions that I mentioned that we've seen happen have actually had regional early adoption followed by global mass market action. And so what this implies is a possibility, especially if in 12 months' time we don't face a different outcome in another attempt at having a discussion of this nature, is that model might well be what we need. And that will need governments who I think started to head in that direction. You mentioned the Clydebank Declaration in the introduction, that was COP26. Governments made a noise that they wanted to head in that direction. And that was before the IMO adopted its revised strategy. And perhaps those governments looked at the IMO and thought, maybe we don't have to put our hand in our own public funding. Maybe we can let the IMO do the heavy lifting here. And now I hope they will be going back and saying, was that the right decision? Maybe we needed to do something ourselves a bit more. And if there was a time for them to take action, it's certainly now in this gap and period whilst we're waiting to find out exactly how the IMO resolves.
Right. I mean, you mentioned about Scandinavia, and I'm actually not familiar with the particulars on that case, but in terms of the LNG and that being the spark of that, could you just say a little bit more about that, because just to give it some context?
Yeah, so a colleague in our group, Domagoj Berejczyk, is an energy transition specialist, and we've always tried to look at this both from the perspective of what does a spreadsheet tell us the least cost technology pathway looks like, but also what's our understanding of how transitions have unfolded in the past. And he spent his PhD digging into this really interesting example that Norwegian and Swedish and to a certain extent the Netherlands governments all stepped in to provide the regime that supported early adoption of LNG. Now that was initially on small ferries that were operating across fjords, but then progressively became a technology that was deployed on vessels that were operating, say, in the Baltic, and now obviously more internationally. And the stimulus was not just like covering the commercial business case, but also in enabling the safety regime and providing the support in the R&D base to solve the series of problems that you needed to overcome in order to make sure that there was some commercial use of that technology. It's not unsurprising. Norway is a major gas producer, so they have an interest in gas being used as a fuel, which was presumably part of the motivation. But not all of the countries in that region had that. A lot of them had significant equipment manufacturers or desires to be producers of high quality tonnage that was being used globally. And so when you put all of those factors together, you can understand the political motivation, and then you can see how, rather than try and expect this to be driven by an IMO regulatory decision, they took the initiative to make progress themselves, significantly funded by something called the NOx tax, amongst other mechanisms that they used. So countries have the ability to regulate shipping unilaterally, as obviously the EU is exercising at this point in time, and maybe we will see increasingly as a response to a failure by the IMO to take action on this occasion.
Well, I mean, that'll be interesting to see as it rolls out. I'm just reading Bill Gates's wet blanket throwing over the entire field this week. His comments about how the pity of the lovely Europeans and their climate thoughts, and they're basically saying they're doomed, which was a fun thing to read today. Thanks Bill. But I guess I wanted to just dwell for a minute on that kind of moment where in the negotiations it became clear, to the extent that we were going there. So I wanted to get this because, again, this is like, there's definitely it might not be the most high tension film in the history of the world. It's like, I'm not sure Jason Bourne might be involved, but certainly there's a political thriller in the skullduggery that seems to have happened leading up to this. Where I remember seeing the comments of the Secretary General of the IMO saying, whatever we do when we come back together, let's not do this again. So it obviously was pretty traumatic in diplomatic terms for the folks who were kind of used to a very different type of process. I mean, can you give any hints? We read that a lot of stuff happened in corridors. A lot of the stuff was not even in back rooms. That there was a lot of at the very last minute of people literally up against walls being told how to change their vote. What can you say about some of that atmosphere?
Oh, sorry.
It's all right.
So the atmosphere was very different. So one of the things that changes is that you see more people who have UNFCCC style negotiation experience, and certainly certain countries brought in UNFCCC negotiators, which shifts this from being a debate where primarily people are putting forward technical arguments and saying, we've weighed up the pros and the cons, we're sharing our evidence. And obviously they tend to bend the evidence towards their political preference, but generally speaking they're just trying to put information out there that they're hoping other countries will find agreeable and sensible and therefore follow them. And so to move from that into a style of negotiating where you could see people consulting, like, how do I disrupt this negotiation? What are the rules of procedure that I could use in order to cause a problem and prevent this, or spread confusion, or change the kind of momentum that was already here, given this is an adoption decision. I think there was work done within the room, but there was also a lot of work done outside of the room in capitals, where obviously the people who are directing what the delegates present in the IMO should be doing are having to make decisions, and those, as the political pressure increases, those decisions move higher up to heads of state, and to my understanding a lot of countries were making their decisions at heads of state level. So therefore the extent to which an individual can be pressured in the room is less important, because if the way that Secretary of State has reached out and explained the consequences in a capital to the head of state, then clearly the individual in the room is going to follow whatever they're told to do rather than act differently. But there are some delegates who have a bit more autonomy, and maybe those are the ones for whom your stories relate. I can't give you a specific example.
Sure. And I guess, but could you give us a sense of the reaction? It's not every negotiation of any kind that the President of the United States feels gets motivated to get on his own social platform and decide to actually comment directly on ongoing negotiations, which happened in the closing hours of demanding a certain outcome. I mean, surely that's unprecedented, even for this weird age in which we find ourselves.
I'm trying to remember. I don't think I've seen this level of head of state attention to the IMO previously, but I don't think it's unwarranted. I mean, this is I don't say I'm grateful for it, but I think this is a sector which is hugely important. It underpins global trade, and global trade is pretty crucial to all of us in the standard of living that we enjoy. And so I don't invite it, but I recognise why this has become a big issue, as well as being maybe something totemic for climate change multilateralism more generally. There's reasons why we could explain the attention that Trump gave to it, not because he cared so much about the shipping sector, but because of a wider ideological war that was being fought and the risk that the IMO would disprove his power in that war. This is an organisation in which the United States has one vote. So obviously what they did was not only use that vote, but use pressure to find others to join their vote. But potentially it was also an organisation that could have demonstrated his impotence if it had gone against him. And so whether that was something sufficiently motivating for him to get involved, I don't know. I can see a justification why he did care about it because of the market opportunity for LNG exports. So there are multiple different hypotheses. But yes, I think your general observation that it's fairly unprecedented is correct. I'm trying to remember, I think in his first administration, when there was sulfur regulation being announced, I think he also might have expressed an opinion, but certainly didn't intervene in the way that he did on this occasion.
Right. I mean, other observers who, I'm behind me is a copy somewhere of Simon Sharp's 5 Times Faster, in which I went back because I remember that there was a few pages that specifically called out the IMO as being a, both potentially, effective forum for a practical amount of climate diplomacy and regulation that would lead to something, again, as you say, the shipping industry is vital. And because historically, it also has been a technological innovator, going back 100 and odd years in propulsion and fuels that are used, etc. And so therefore it has both practical importance and symbolic importance. But I suppose again, with your, even perhaps if you can step outside of your role covering this industry and actually looking at the wider picture, is it concerning, the symbolism coming, so close to, heading into further negotiations, the idea that we had something that was nearly there, that would have been the first of its kind in some ways, and it must be demotivating for the wider community of people who want to see progress in this field, and perhaps that was even more than the LNG exports. The intent was to take the wind out of everyone's sails, not to use a pun.
Yeah, it's concerning, but it's also focusing, and sometimes I think you need to see how extreme things get. My own surprise at how strong the reaction was is also one that I've heard other people talk about, even those who are much more familiar with the US administration than I am, were surprised at how aggressively they operated. So better to be forewarned. I've lost the expression. Is it forewarned and forearmed?
Better forewarned is better as forearmed.
Yeah, thank you. So better to be in that situation going into COP30 than to be kind of assuming that maybe they won't be paying attention or the government shutdown is causing them to be distracted by domestic agenda, etc. So I think that's useful. But also I think a kind of reminder of the multiple tactics that need to be in place to have successful transitions. I mean, we shouldn't put all our eggs in any one basket. This was one that we put a lot of effort into, and I still think we shouldn't write off for any at this point at all. But we should be pursuing a strategy that has multiple different ways in which we can enable early adoption and work to bring forwards a mass market transition in due course as well.
Well, you've been very generous with your time, Tristan Smith from UCL. I want to thank you for this, and I guess we'll be keeping an eye on things that you and your team will be publishing to understand better about as these things progress. So we'll keep an eye on that. We'll post links in the show notes as well, where people can also follow your work.
Thanks, Richard. Nice to talk to you.
For years, climate advocates saw the IMO negotiations as a rare bright spot, like industry, governments, all coming together to agree a way forward. Certainly not perfect, nothing ever is, but certainly a way that people felt confident right into the last minute that would give people a pathway forward for an industry trying to actually solve a problem as opposed to denying its existence. In a vital industry, one responsible for 80% of world trade. But the optimism collapsed when it came head-on with Trumpist realpolitik. So I asked Carly Hicks, Chief Strategy and Impact Officer at Opportunity Green, what the breakdown tells us, where the balance of power is in climate diplomacy. And we're back. I'm so delighted we could be joined by Carly Hicks, Chief Strategy and Impact Officer at the not-for-profit Opportunity Green. Carly, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Richard.
Fan of what you guys have been doing for a good couple of years now, since we started this effort. I wonder if you could start by just, before we get into it, just to make sure for the audience to contextualize what you guys do at Opportunity Green, maybe in short.
Sure. So at Opportunity Green, we seek to close the gaps in global climate action. It's a very ambitious aim. So essentially what that means is that we work primarily on the demand side sectors. So we don't kind of work on the sort of oil and gas supply side, but we recognize that supply and demand are kind of two sides of the same coin. So what we try to do is to reduce the emissions that are coming from those demand side sectors. Primarily at the moment, we're looking at international aviation and shipping. They're really our kind of staples and what we've been looking at over the course of the last 4 years since we were founded. We also look at steel, we look at agriculture, which obviously has enormous emissions associated with that sector. We look at trucks, or kind of, sort of the middle-sized lorries that you see around on the roads. And we also kind of look at underpinning all of that really is the finance angle. So recognizing that it's really important that we make the right investment decisions now to kind of ensure that for the decades to come, we've got the right technologies and right fuel types, helping those sectors decarbonize.
That's super helpful, Carly. We're talking today, obviously, about the IMO and about shipping. So that's one of the main sectors that you guys spend a lot of time on in terms of analyzing and covering. So we've just had this, as I've just talked about in the intro, that we've just been through this major event. But I think that for many people, for whom this is news. The backstory about how long this kind of conversation has been going on that led to this moment, this vote to basically kick the can down the road for a year. Whereas you guys have been over this for, the detail on this for really quite a bit longer, and even probably individually, probably even before the formation of you guys in 2021. So I wonder if you can just give us a bit of the back history. I mean, I've heard some people describe this as 10 years to negotiations that have just been nuked. So I mean, is that accurate, or can you give us a little bit of the backstory and why this is so important, why it matters?
Yeah, so I guess just to kind of take it right back to the basics. So the IMO, which is the International Maritime Organization, it's the United Nations agency which has responsibility for the safety and security of shipping. Over time, it's also kind of taken on responsibility in relation to the protection of the marine environment and atmospheric pollution by ships. And that essentially means greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So that kind of agency has been in place for decades. And as you've rightly identified, that agency has been discussing the regulation of GHG emissions from ships also for really quite a long time. As with quite a lot of UN agencies, it's sort of the nature of the beast really that when you've got, I think, 198 member states in the room, it takes a long time to move that sort of behemoth of an industry to whatever place you want to steer it really. So it has taken a long time. Discussions have, as you've rightly said, kind of been ongoing for almost a decade now, and certainly before Opportunity Green was around. In fact, one of the reasons that we were founded was as identifying the need to have more civil society organisations working with it in the International Maritime Organization. So back in April this year, the agency agreed what was called the Net Zero Framework, and that set really quite an ambitious and certainly historic mandatory greenhouse gas emission reduction target for international shipping and a global pricing mechanism for emissions. This is the first time that we've seen an agency like the IMO agree such an international pricing mechanism. So it really was an historic agreement. So there was agreement on the kind of political, this political framework, so to speak, the political aim back in April. And then we saw scheduled for October what was called an extraordinary session of the IMO, in which that framework was intended to be formally adopted by member states. So just to maybe just go on. You were going to...
No, go ahead.
Okay, so that agreement, as I mentioned, was was really historic agreement. It aimed to achieve net zero for international shipping by or around 2050. So it has a gradual reduction on emissions over time. The agreement was going to be mandatory for ships over 5,000 gross tonnage. So they're the really big cargo ships that you see delivering into, for example, the port of Antwerp or Rotterdam. And that was going to cover approximately 85% of total CO2 emissions from international shipping. Alongside that, it also established a net zero fund. So that was to, like I said, price emissions and also to reward low emission shipping and issue levies for vessels that exceeded those thresholds. And part of that net zero fund, which is really key for Opportunity Green, we work with climate vulnerable countries. And what we wanted to see from that was that those monies that go into that fund were then paid out to climate vulnerable countries who really need the support to transition their industries kind of away from the more polluting side of things to that kind of green transition that we really want to see. So as I said, it was intended
And so,
go on.
No, I'm sorry. I think we're slightly out of sync on the connection, so I'm trying to give a maximum amount of pause there. But I was just going to come back and just to dig in a little bit on the stakes, because you mentioned the fund and you mentioned climate vulnerable states being a key area of concern. And I guess we've been talking about climate finance as defined in various ways, but whether it comes to helping actually move economies, particularly in climate vulnerable states, through transition, or indeed adaptation measures, that are necessary to cope with some of the effects. This seems like a no-brainer of a mechanism, where we had an entire industry on board with this. In April, like you said, we had a vote that seemed to be like all ahead, no obstacles. And then, I just want to focus on the stakes. Basically, like, we all thought this was going to be, if not necessarily perfect, but like it was going to have a lot going for it, right? It was going to be the first time an industry had a carbon price, essentially, that was going to be used both to lever a change in what fuels were used to power global shipping, but also to help use the funds that would be accrued from this incentive structure, this market-based incentive structure, to move, also to help assist, smaller island states, particularly small island states, to be able to help both transition their economies, their energy systems, but also, to cope with some of the effects that we can now expect to see. So, like, and of course, there are a lot of incumbents and tech players that decided to make investments based on the idea that this was all going ahead. So, like, how. I might be overreading this, but it seemed to me like there's an awful lot of work that went into this, an awful lot of players, stakeholders on various sides that decided, to invest based on the idea this was the direction of travel. And that just, all seemed to be, if not destroyed, then certainly set back significantly. Am I overreading that?
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't agree that it's been destroyed, I think is my take. So from our perspective, the net zero framework is definitely not dead. So what has happened is that there was a vote to adjourn the decision for a year. Obviously, exactly as you've kind of said, it's kind of kicking the can down the road a little bit. But I think what we kind of take at Opportunity Green is that gives us 12 months, both to strengthen the support from both the climate vulnerable countries and other countries who have real skin in the game here, because it matters. This international mechanism matters. And I think the extent to which it matters was kind of shown by what happened in October, where exactly as you've identified, we didn't anticipate it was going to be easy, but we had that agreement back in April, and we thought to some greater or lesser extent it was going to be kind of rubber stamped in October. That's obviously not what happened. There are a number of states who made things slightly more difficult than we'd anticipated. But it really
Okay, we're among friends. You can say who. It's okay.
So I guess the sudden spotlight, but from countries like the US, just really kind of underline how important this agreement was. So the US in April essentially just didn't take part in the discussions. So the representatives turned up and then walked out shortly afterwards. But they've sort of really upped their engagement this time around, and we're really advocating for this vote not to be destroyed, actually. And in many ways, I guess, when you look at it from that perspective, the fact that it's only been adjourned for a year is actually a positive. And, I've been around in politics and climate negotiations for my sin for long enough that I know that, the direction of travel is really important. And I think the direction of travel here is more a case of when this happens rather than if this happens. Because if the last 10 years have shown us anything, it's that there is global movement towards a pricing mechanism. As I said, it's important for a lot of countries. It's also important for industry to have that regulatory certainty such that they know where to put their money and what investment decisions to make. So the fact that there's, another year now to really consolidate positions, to focus on the technical guidelines that are really important, as you've highlighted, for the climate vulnerable countries here, that is in the grand scheme of things, it's more than a drop in the water, but it's not kind of putting the dampener on everything.
I mean, and I hear what you're saying about it being a delay, not the end of the road, necessarily for the NZF or NZF. But in terms of whether or not, even with some sort of actuarial event, if I can put it that way, resulting in a change of U.S. leadership, the environment doesn't feel necessarily like it's going to be very different in a year. So is there like a plan B under discussion? I mean, thinking of things like, people like Simon Sharp have advocated talking about green corridors, this Clydesbank declaration that was talked about at COP26, this idea that you're going to have, instead of a global multilateral framework, that there will be smaller, more niche, bilateral, country to country, firm to firm, types of agreements that are building more from the ground up rather than this, kind of having a standard that, yes, it helps the industry to align, but it's vulnerable to these types of whatever you want to call that, what just happened.
Yeah, I mean, yes. So I guess my first kind of thought there is that we will be working hard for the next year to make sure that the next kind of bite of the cherry gets this thing over the line. That is our first and foremost priority. And that is the first and foremost priority for many of the countries that we work with. There are other things happening, notwithstanding that. And for example, so my background is as a lawyer. And what we've seen over the course of the past couple of years is that there have been really quite weighty advisory opinions on what countries' obligations are under international law to decarbonise. For example, the top of the hierarchy in that regard earlier this year was the International Court of Justice, So the International Court of Justice opinion has confirmed that states have binding obligations to prevent significant environmental harm. And that includes by regulating private actors. And when I say environmental harm here, I mean climate change, essentially. I mean regulating GHG emissions. So states have binding obligations on kind of unilaterally on themselves to take action here. So to the extent that there hasn't been an agreement at the global level, which is currently the case, and like I say, we're working hard to make sure that that does happen next year. But in the absence of that, states do still have these obligations to decarbonise. And I have no doubt that they will be looking to other means. You've mentioned kind of green shipping corridors and things like that, which we don't work so closely on at Opportunity Green, but there are other fantastic NGOs that do, and they have a lot of value. There are also, I guess, other sort of more regional agreements that could be come up with to in sort of a coalition of the willing of states who want to move further and more quickly. And as I mentioned at the beginning, one thing that we look at a lot is finance and how we can use financing to make sure that investment decisions are going into the right place. So one of the things that we're working hard on at the moment on our legal side is the EU sustainable financing rules on, so otherwise known as a taxonomy. And we are actually challenging the European Commission's taxonomy on shipping, because at the moment we see that could incentivize investment into LNG, which we know is not green, is not kind of a green solution. So there are so many different levers that can be pulled, all of which sort of work in the same direction. Our priority, as I say, is that global agreement. But in the absence of that, there are different things that can be done and are already being done.
And want to just because you might have more of a perspective on this. We've covered the ICJ, advisory opinion and some of the things that led up to it, and over a number of episodes. And so I'm going to give the audience a little bit of credence that they're probably familiar with some of the basics. But I wonder, I wanted to ask you as somebody who's far closer to this and far more expert and trained than certainly I am. I'm trying to work out how that ICJ advisory opinion might translate into being used as part of an action, right? So is it that one state? So, I recently interviewed the climate minister from Tuvalu, Main Italia. And we were talking a little bit about, where that ruling might come in terms of some of, the things that Tuvalu and other small island states might pursue in future. But how would it roll out in this context? Would you bring an action that sort of you wind up suing the United States for failing to vote the right way at the IMO? I'm just trying to try to translate it down into concrete narrative terms. How would this actually work? As an hypothetical example, if that's not a completely unfair question.
No, not an unfair question at all. And it is a great question and something that we've certainly been kind of grappling with at Opportunity Green as well. So I think there are two ways that I see this happening. One way in which we're already seeing that all of these advisory opinions are starting to have impact is just the soft law pressure, I suppose, that we are seeing being brought to bear on things like the IMO negotiations. And of course, the IMO negotiations have not quite gone the way that we'd hoped this time around, but we hope that they will do in the future. We are seeing climate vulnerable countries that are using, through sort of diplomacy, the outcomes from the things like the ICJ advisory opinion to put in submissions to these long ongoing international negotiations to really highlight to other states that it is important that states take these obligations seriously, and that states that don't potentially do then have what we call international state accountability. And essentially that means, to your point, that potentially one of them will be sued by one of these other climate vulnerable states who have incurred harm as a result of climate inaction. There are obviously, and I would be naive not to not to think about the fact that there are enormous political considerations that would go along with a state bringing an interstate action under sort of the ICJ forum. And as any good lawyer will tell you, litigation should always be a last resort as well. So, our first action isn't going to be supporting a state to bring a litigious case against the USA. And nor do I think that you could necessarily build one on the case of what's happened at the IMO. Potentially, it would form part of the building of an evidence base to say, look, country, without naming names,
Right.
you've not done what you ought to be doing. You do have binding obligations to prevent significant environmental harm, and your actions in this international forum showed that you don't take that responsibility seriously. But the action, those specific actions aren't, in my view, actionable in a sort of legal case. And like I say, it's really
but basically,
I was just going to say, and really, it should always be a last resort as much as anything. And there are so many, as I've outlined, there are so many other ways that we should be using these to really pressure better action in the first place.
Got it. And I suppose it is true that people who make submissions, send these letters, they do tell on themselves a little bit by revealing a little more perhaps than they intend when they write about their motivations for why they're deciding to pursue a certain policy. And I suppose one of the other things I wanted to ask, because it is one of the hardcore realpolitik aspects of this, and one of the reasons why you would again want to avoid interstate litigation, because the consequences are not necessarily great for those people who are on the wrong side of the power equation, is that like the multilateral framework itself is vulnerable to these types of attacks by any actor. Let's not single out one, or any recipient of that attack. In that, I was reading again, like going through the IMO's incredibly detailed database of minutes and everything else going back to years in terms of meetings, and how many of the small island states and climate vulnerable states, of course, rely on funding even just to attend the meeting, which just underlines the fact that like these are not state actors that have the same capacity as every other state actor, and so a system that imagines that they does not necessarily take into account their vulnerability to the types of pressure that some, again, according to the media reporting, some states said that, well, we had to change our vote because the tariffs or other sanctions that were being threatened against us were simply too great. And therefore, even though we know it's not in our interest, we've decided we had to take a pragmatic decision to change our vote to please a power that was threatening us, which is a pretty dire state of affairs. And I guess I want to ask you a really unfair question, which is like, does that not tell us something about the entire way that we've conducted climate diplomacy, whether it be at a sectoral level or at a bigger level over the last 30 years? And is this not the end of that? Because if we're just going to go to this kind of power, bare knuckle, no disguising the fact, power politics, to serve, because we want to sell more LNG. Is that not just kind of destroy the premise of the whole basis of negotiations for the last 30 years? Just a small question to end on.
Yeah, thanks for that. I guess, I think, as I said towards the start, I've been around this for long enough that I know that there will always be setbacks. We at Opportunity Green don't see this as the end of the story by any stretch of the imagination. You're right that it definitely asks questions as to kind of how we conduct these negotiations. And one of the reasons that we started to work in this sector was exactly to the point that you have mentioned, that we find that a lot of these countries that we support, exactly as you say, they need money to get the flight to London to take part in these negotiations. They have people who are leading on this stuff who have 5 other portfolios to follow throughout the year. So what we do is we provide really technical briefings to them. We Sherpa them around the building. We show them where to get the good coffee or where not to get the good coffee, to where the really simple stuff that is important if you are going to be impactful in these organizations. And I think the work that we've done, perhaps, I'm very biased, obviously, but I do believe that it is important, and I do believe that it is impactful. And I am strongly of the opinion that the next time around, we will have really done the baseline work, even more than we already have done, to make sure that we get this over the line next time. I still believe in climate multilateralism. I know that there are people who don't, but I think, and somebody who works in climate, maybe I have or necessarily need to have a slightly more positive worldview than others might do. But I do believe we can get there. I think this is an industry that, more broadly, has the space to pay for this stuff. So we released earlier this year a report essentially outlining the really low tax rates that shipping companies pay. So 4 biggest companies in the world, we're talking the Maersks, the CMA, CGMs of the world, they made over half of all profits globally at about $175 billion. And they paid about $5 billion in taxes. So that's a tax rate of about 3%. But, that just shows the sort of the width, the bandwidth that there is in this industry for both supporting decarbonisation, but also supporting a just and equitable transition, and doing the right thing through solidarity for these countries who need us to act on climate. They're sinking. They need to change now. And I guess maybe a slightly sort of out of sector thought as well. So we're seeing on international aviation, which we also work closely on, as I mentioned, we're seeing the coming together of the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force, which you may have heard of. And so that's a group of countries, sort of willing, a coalition of the willing, as it were. And they've come together to support a solidarity levy. And the sector that they have honed in on for the time being is international aviation. Another sector on which there's very little taxation and very little recognition of the role that sector plays in terms of its pollution. So there are countries that are really recognising solidarity, so the need to support the least best off by with that support being given by those who are the best off, sort of globally. And that is, that still remains a really important principle for international multilateralism. And I really do believe that we can, like I say, that we can get there. It's absolutely not kind of the death knell for any of this stuff. I think those principles are really solid. I think solidarity as a principle is really solid. And like I say, this is just a kind of quite a large bump in the road, but a bump in the road, no less.
Well, that seems like a perfect place to leave it. We'll definitely want to get some links in the show notes to make sure that people can find out more about some of the things that you mentioned from Opportunity Green, but also to find out more about the organization and potentially how they might be able to support it and the work that you guys are doing. So thank you, Carly Hicks, Chief Strategy and Impact Officer for Opportunity Green, for joining us.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
So another extraordinary session ends in paralysis, and this one feels quite different. The U.S. isn't just as it did in April, just not showing up for negotiations. It's turning up actively trying to wreck them. Something that does not bode particularly well as the negotiations start in Brazil. My thanks to Carly Hicks, Arianne Morrissey, and Tristan Smith for helping us make sense of that story. If the FT reporting is right, and by all accounts it squares what these insiders told us and others, the U.S. didn't just lean on allies. It actively tore up the diplomatic rule book. And that matters because ships ordered today will still be in service in 2050, meaning that the opportunity to be able to actually make change has slipped away, at least for now. And in politics terms, that just means that another instance of kicking the can down the road. but perhaps this might be one kick too far. You can find links to the work of all my guests in the show notes, as well as that FT reporting, and we'll see you again soon.
Norfolk Sierra. Southerly becoming variable 2 to 4, showers later, good. South at Sierra. Easterly and southeasterly becoming variable 2 to 4, then northwesterly 3 to 5 later, fair, good. 40s, quality 4. Variable 2 to 4, becoming east later in 4, showers, good, occasionally poor at first. Time, darker. East to northeast 3 to 5, showers.
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.